Director for Science Education at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, where he directs the undergraduate and graduate program group aimed at the development of students in the domain of formal education. Dr. Asai's bachelor's degree is in chemistry from Stanford University, and he has a PhD in biochemistry from Caltech. Before coming to Howard Hughes Medical Institute in 2008, Dr. Asai was professor and head of biological sciences at Purdue University. He also held the Stuart Mudd Professor and Chair of Biology at Harvey Mudd College. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a fellow of the American Society for Cell Biology. We look forward this morning to his talk on Race Really Matters. Dr. Asai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maureen. You know, I really appreciate this opportunity to share some thoughts with you this morning. I just want to echo what Karen said earlier about how important your work is. As I understand it, the goal of the 3 universities comprising the AGEP-NC project is to increase the number of Black and Brown faculty in the STEM disciplines. As I understand it, your strategy emphasizes faculty learning and changing departmental culture. And I believe that this approach is spot on. When all of us take responsibility for changing the culture, that's when we will finally make some progress. So what does that mean to change the culture? Cornel West, in his 1993 landmark book, Race Matters, reminds us that culture is structural and it is manifested by behaviors. In higher education and STEM, structures and behaviors include the curriculum, the policies and processes that signal whether a person feels that they belong, and the system that rewards certain behaviors. So race matters. The white center of power decides who belongs and who is excluded. Now, when I say the white center of power, I'm not referring to the skin color of those who are in power, because indeed there are persons of all colors at the center, and there are persons of all colors on the outside looking in. Rather, the white center of power in America refers to a social structure created by and for persons, almost all male, who descended from white Northern European immigrants. Their perspectives became the norms of our society, of our economy, of our educational system, of our science. As Emma Dabiri describes in her new book, What White People Can Do Next, the concept of whiteness was formalized as a legal concept in 1661 by an Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes. The Barbados Slave Code, as it is known, codified slavery and formally separated whites and blacks, or Negroes, as distinct and separate races. The Barbados Slave Code served as the model for laws in other British colonies, including South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Maryland, and other parts of the New World. And let's be clear that science is complicit. The racialization of society was justified by the leading scientists of their time, who decided, wrongly, that there are genetically distinct human races which evolved independently. And if there are different races, then scientists could organize humans into a racialized hierarchy in terms of intelligence, industriousness, ingenuity, sexuality, criminal behavior, and others. And so what I'm saying is that the imprimatur of science was the authoritative cover for enslavement and sterilization. Now, a fundamental characteristic of a system that is white-centered is that we are unprepared and unwilling to deeply examine race and racism. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of recent examples of America dipping its little toe into the ocean of race in the last few years, and especially after the video recorded murder of George Floyd 412 days ago. Many Americans have been energized. We've marched in the streets, we've toppled statues, We have renamed academic buildings, and we've issued brave statements pledging to become anti-racist. But these are the easy things. These are the superficial things. I think that the harder thing to do is to truly change our culture, to walk our talk. Even as many of us declare loudly that now is the time for a racial reckoning, too many liberals and defenders of free speech are afraid to even whisper the words critical race theory. Our reluctance to grapple with the concepts of the white center of power and critical race theory has created a vacuum. And that vacuum has been filled by people who distort and weaponize CRT. So today, in many states, including North Carolina, there is legislation like HB 324 that bans the teaching of the concepts underlying critical race theory. So I think it's important to consider for a moment the arguments that people argue for banning CRT. You know, one argument for is that it makes white people feel guilty. But that's not the purpose of CRT. Rather, critical race theory recognizes that racism is embedded throughout our system. And therefore, the responsibility for ending racism is on all of us, white, black, brown, all of us, because all of us are part of the system. So if it is about guilt, then we are all guilty. Another argument against CRT is that there is little evidence for systemic racism. Instead, people argue that, well, it's just a few bad actors, you know, they don't know and they're causing all this trouble. Well, that's wrong. There is a myriad of examples of deeply embedded systemic racism, including just these few that I'm going to just try to list here. So in yesterday's Washington Post is an article by Hannah Dreier that explains why so many Black families in the rural South are denied FEMA loans when their homes are destroyed by a natural disaster, such as Tropical Storm Elsa. Because Black persons were excluded from the legal system during the Jim Crow era, many properties, representing more than a third of Black-owned land in the South, have been passed down from generation to generation as so-called heirs property without a deed. But to qualify for a federal loan, FEMA requires that a person must provide legal evidence, such as a deed or mortgage. Also in yesterday's Washington Post is an article by Karina Elwood about Roger Davis, a Black man who was sentenced to 40 years in prison and was in and out of prison for more than a decade for selling 3 ounces of marijuana back in 1973. You know, half a century later, after Roger Davis, Sha'Carri Richardson will not run in the 2021 Olympics because she tested positive for marijuana, even though all agree that marijuana does not give her a competitive advantage, nor is it a threat to public health. But Michael Andrew will swim in the same Olympics, even though he refuses to be vaccinated for COVID, which certainly is a threat to public health. And the Olympics has banned soul caps, not because they confer competitive advantage, because they don't, but because, well, this is what the Olympic folks say, because no one in the past has worn one. And then there's race norming. Race norming appears in many of the algorithms used in modern medical diagnosis. It is unsupported by objective evidence and is based on the false premise that races are genetically different. The impact of race norming is that a person of color has a significantly greater chance of being underdiagnosed so that needed treatment is withheld. Racialized diagnoses include cognitive ability, heart disease, respiratory capacity, kidney disease, kidney stones, diagnosis of urinary tract infections, and deciding whether a baby should be delivered by cesarean section. Now, these examples are not just because there's an evil person who's deciding to do harm. Rather, these and many other acts of racism are because the policies and rules, no matter how they were intended, result in the exclusion of people. So we have a long way to go before recentering science on equity and inclusion. You know, it is not uncommon today for some, including prominent scientists, to state with certainty that an increase in diversity necessarily means a decrease in scientific excellence, as if diversity and excellence are components of a zero-sum game. And so when we use scientific rigor as our excuse for lack of diversity, when in our teaching and in our textbooks, we tell only the stories of the white founding fathers of science, when in our recruiting of students and the hiring of faculty, we rely on a person's pedigree as a proxy for scientific excellence, when we bestow awards on individuals for individual success instead of encouraging interdisciplinary collaboration, we are perpetuating the white center of power. In science, we often refer to a person of color as a so-called URM, but that's just not right. Persons of color are not the numerical minority. In fact, 85% of the world's population are persons of non-European ethnicities. Nor are persons of color a minority as defined by the dictionary, which defines minority as lesser, diminished, and subordinate. The UR part of URM stands for underrepresented, but underrepresentation is the symptom and not the cause. The cause is that the culture of science has systematically excluded persons of color. So instead of URM, I use PEER, P-E-E-R, which stands for persons excluded from science because of their ethnicity or race. We can disaggregate peers into different ethnic groups, but today I'll use peer in the aggregate. And by peers in science include Blacks or African Americans, Latinx or Hispanics, and persons belonging to populations indigenous to the US and its territories. The system fails to keep peers in STEM, even though peers are well represented at the start of the academic pathway. Today, peers are 37% of all undergraduates in the United States, but only 21% of STEM bachelor's degrees, only 12% of STEM PhDs, and about 6% of tenured track and tenured faculty in STEM. This is a disproportionate shedding of peers from STEM, and it is not due to their lack of interest. Peers are actually overrepresented among students entering college intending to study STEM. Nor is the disproportionate loss of peers due simply to their lack of preparation. In studies dating back at least 20 years that have controlled for important factors, including high school math, high school science, family interest in higher education, and family income, peers leave STEM at much greater rates than non-peers. Among students entering college, the interest in studying STEM is the same for peers and non-peers. But the persistence in STEM by each group is vastly different. Peers intending to major in STEM earned a bachelor's degree at only half the rate of non-peers and earned a PhD at only 1/4 the rate of non-peers. But the really scary part about these data is that these disparities in persistence, these same relationships, have not changed in at least 3 decades. So in those 3 decades, gazillions of dollars have been spent on a myriad of programs aimed at increasing racial and ethnic diversity in science. Here are just a few examples of these many interventions. We have pre-college summer bridge programs, remedial courses and special advising, summer research experiences, so-called minority supplements to research grants, cluster hiring for diversity, and special mentoring programs aimed at peers who are faculty members. You know, these interventions are well-intentioned and they are led by terrific people. Many of these interventions help the persons who are participating. But as the unchanging persistence data show, these interventions are not sufficient to create systemic and sustained change. These interventions are examples of what I'm going to refer to as a fix the peer mindset, or when I'm more cynical, a blame the victim mindset. The fix the peer mindset has 3 sort of characteristics or hallmarks. And we've all done this. The first characteristic is that peers are treated as a commodity. The system rewards us for collecting peers. Having more peers helps us win training grants. And it looks good when we are undergoing departmental or university review and accreditation. Normally peers are mostly ignored, except when it's time to illustrate our brochures and websites. The second characteristic of the fix the peer mindset is that interventions are aimed at helping the peer fit in, to assimilate into a scientific culture that is not theirs. As a result, peers and people from other underrepresented groups are unable to be their authentic selves when studying and working in our universities. And the third characteristic is that peers are often expected to bear the burden of change. There are some who mean well, who claim that when their students who identify as peers dress nicely and they come to class on time and they sit in the front row and they ask questions, well, then the faculty and university magically become inclusive. It's as if the faculty and the university doesn't have to do any work, that the students, it's on the students to change the university. And then, of course, there's the diversity tax that we are all familiar with, in which a faculty member from an underrepresented group is asked to serve on every committee, admissions, recruiting, advising, the DEI committees, because we depend on them to do our work for advancing diversity. So instead of fixing the peers, we must change the culture of science and science education. Changing the culture means recognizing peers as peers and not as a commodity. Changing the culture means ensuring that our structures, our policies, procedures, curriculum, system of rewards, that all of these genuinely reflect the values and perspectives of all of the participants instead of continuing to uphold the white center of power. And changing the culture means that we, who are currently in charge of the system, must accept and act on our responsibility to change the system. So as faculty members committed to excellence in undergraduate education and in graduate education and in advancing diversity in the faculty, what should we do to achieve culture change, specifically in graduate education and faculty hiring? Well, I don't have the answers, but I'm going to pose 3 questions that might guide our work. The first question is, we should just ask, who gets in and why? If we are still relying on standardized tests like the GRE to inform graduate admissions, it is important to ask ourselves why. There have been several studies that show that often often relied upon measures like the GRE and undergraduate GPA are just not accurate predictors of success in graduate school. To paraphrase Josh Hall, who was the primary author of the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill study, success in the program is a function of what happens during the program rather than what the students scored on the test before they applied to join the program. And in faculty recruiting, do we rely too heavily on academic pedigree and whom we know, or otherwise the old boys network? And so before we start hiring more persons of color, we, who comprise the search committee, the hiring departments, we must first be able to clearly articulate why diversity is important for our department, rather than depend on the candidates to explain to us the value of diversity. There's a very interesting essay by Sensoy and D'Angelo in 2017 that talks to this. Well, the second question that I would suggest that we think about is, well, how do we decide who is worthy of staying? We should provide all faculty the opportunity and incentives to develop inclusive pedagogical and mentoring skills. And then we should create reliable and fair methods to assess the effectiveness and inclusivity of their teaching and mentoring. And then finally, we should include those assessments in our reward system, including promotion and tenure. And then my third question for us is, well, what do we celebrate? In our newsletters, in our websites, our reward systems, we should recognize accomplishments of all types, not only for individual achievements, but also for effective collaborations and effective cross-disciplinary work. And in our teaching, we should tell the stories of current living scientists from all backgrounds, and there are plenty of them to talk about, instead of only teaching the discoveries of the white founding fathers. Now, these aren't new ideas, right? You know this stuff. You know these better than I do. You don't need me to preach about these things. In fact, much of today, we will be spending sharing and debating some ideas of yours about diversity in science. And so rather than me continuing to tell you what I think you should do, I'd like to spend a few minutes exploring what you think you need to do to achieve the goals of the AGEP-NC project. And the goals, as I understand them, is, again, to increase the diversity of STEM PhDs and STEM faculty. And so my colleague, Angie Pena, who is on this call here, is going to help me conduct a Slido poll. And so I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to say one more thing, Angie, and then I'll turn it over to you. So this coordination is really cool, right? This long distance Zoom coordination. So my first question, and Angie will get us there in just a second, is what is one of the most important things that must change to achieve your goals? And I'm aiming for a one-word answer. So your answer won't actually say what change you want, but rather in what area. So for example, if you think that it is important to improve graduate admissions, then you should write admissions. So we're going to share our ideas on Slido, and your responses are anonymous and will not be saved. So here's Angie. Go, please, Angie. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So I'll share my screen again. So you can join these polls by going to slido.com and typing in the event code AGEP, or you can scan this QR code and we will move on to the next question. Which is, in a single word, name what you think should change on your campus to improve inclusion for STEM graduate education.
Give it another few seconds here. I think we have 66 participants, so we're up at 41 responses here. So what we're seeing, or what I'm seeing, is that there's a number of people who have put down funding and mentoring. We have recruitment, leadership, faculty, attitudes. Okay. So we'll let that end then, Angie. And before we go to the second question, let me just say one word here. So we have a lot of good ideas, and you have identified a number of domains that are important. But I think it also takes more than a good idea. All of the ideas in the world won't matter unless the people in the institution are part of the process of changing the culture. The folks attending today's workshop represent more than 800 faculty in your departments at the 3 universities. So, Angie, here's my second question. And go ahead, Angie.
So what % of STEM faculty are actively working to make sure these changes happen on your campus? And please type your answer as a numerical %.
Great. So we see a range here. We see some large numbers like 65%, 40, 50%. And then we also see some pretty small numbers. And I think that that's what I would have expected, that it's often the champions, the people who are at this meeting today that are often leading the charge. And it is sometimes challenging, right, to get others, our colleagues, to join. And so we have good ideas and we have good people. We have people at this meeting. You know, if that were sufficient, then we would be much further along toward achieving our goals. But we're not there yet. And so my third question is, Angie?
What is a barrier to advancing inclusion in STEM graduate education on your campus?
So what we're saying is, what is the greatest barrier to progress? What's keeping you back? All right. So thank you. We have a number of identified barriers. A major one is, people are saying, is funding, faculty, lack of support. And then there are a number of other things that people are saying, which I think are also very important. We talk about mindsets. And
so we started off, I asked him,
This
I
is-
said, so I want to see what I asked him specifically. I asked him, I said, I was going to ask you what you gained. I asked him what did he gain from.
So thank you. So Angie, you can take that down and let me just finish up what I was going to say this morning. So I appreciate your participation, because this was a way for me to hear from you, but also perhaps for you to be thinking about these things a little bit. I was thinking about these same questions, and I was considering what might typically happen. So from my view, here's what typically happens. We go to a meeting like this one. We get fired up. We see all the ways that we can get better. We create lists of things to do, and we debate their relative priorities. Sometimes a meeting might even write a so-called white paper or publish a list of recommendations. And then we return to the realities of our job. And we are almost instantly consumed and subsumed by the daily hard work of just keeping all of the trains running on time. Many of you said that funding was one of the major barriers. This project has substantial funding. And so what I'm trying to understand is, are there other barriers besides not having the money to do things? I think that we might want to change, but we just don't have the time to do it. And I'm not suggesting that time and money are the same in this case. The real barrier to genuine culture change is the lack of time. So I think we need more time for reflection. Reflection on how the structures of science and science education uphold the white center of power, and how we erect barriers to preserve the center. We need time to learn the skills of inclusion and practicing the skills of listening, so that we can talk candidly about race and racism and cultural privilege. And we need time to develop and implement strategies, holding ourselves accountable by taking action and then assessing the effectiveness of our actions. So we don't lack for good ideas, and we don't lack for heroes who are prepared to do the work. What we lack is the time to reflect, learn, and be accountable. And to make time means that we have to decide what not to do. And so this brings me to my what if dreaming. Here's my what if scenario that I just wanted to suggest here. I mean to be provocative. You all are doing this work, but I just want to put this out there sort of as a crazy idea. So what if our department or school were to suspend all other activities for a period of time, so that faculty, staff, and students could focus on culture change with respect to equity and inclusion? For example, what if we put everything else aside for 1 month in the fall and another month in the spring to engage in this work? The fall might be time for facilitated reflection and learning, and then collectively deciding on 1 or 2 things we want to accomplish in the coming months. We should set realistic goals that will lead to bigger outcomes. For example, we might choose to begin the process of examining recruiting and hiring processes, or digging into how to change the criteria for promotion and tenure. In the spring, we would come together again to reflect on the past year, to assess our progress, and to hold ourselves accountable. And it would be exciting to make this a recurring habit, regularly stepping away from everything else to focus on equity and inclusion. Well, when should we try this? And I would suggest we try it now. The shutdown over the past year has shown us that the Earth will not stop spinning on its axis just because we aren't doing some of the things we used to. So instead of emerging from the COVID shutdown with our heads down, instead of narrowly intent on just returning to the way we did things before, I think we should take a deep breath and ask ourselves what we can do differently and better. Because the way we were should not be what we are in the future. Now, of course, there are millions of reasons why this is not the time to try my crazy idea. But you know, if equity and inclusion are really institutional values, then eventually, if not now, we must find a way to learn how to walk the talk, to truly catalyze culture change. Culture change does not happen because of fancy rhetoric or strategic plans or even money. Culture change is made real when we find the time to learn how to change our behaviors. So we don't lack for ideas, we don't lack for heroes. Now let's find the time to change our culture. I want to end my talk with you this morning by telling you my tale of culture change and responsibility. And this is a takeoff on the little red hen. One fine spring day, the little red hen had an idea. She thought that it would be a great improvement to the barnyard if they could add some diversity to their menu. Instead of daily pecking at dried corn and munching hay, the citizens of the barnyard would benefit from having some freshly baked bread in their diet. What an improvement that would be, thought the little red hen. Bread will enable some barnyard citizens who cannot easily digest hay or dried corn to obtain important nourishment. It will make all of us stronger. And so the little red hen asked the citizens of the barnyard to help her. Who will help me till the soil and plant the seed? Who will help me weed the field and water the soil? Who will help me harvest the wheat and mill the grain? And who will help me bake the bread? The little red hen asked the barnyard dog if he would help. Well, I really admire your spunk and all, but all of the rest of you only know corn and hay. And, we've survived this long without baked bread. So I don't really see a need to add this stuff. And of course, I don't have to eat corn or hay because I get dog food. So this really doesn't affect me. And besides, I'm a dog, and we all know that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, next was the barnyard cow, who was the most senior citizen of the barnyard. And she responded, well, I don't want to be part of this conversation because it sounds like you're being critical of our current diet of dried corn and hay. And that makes me uncomfortable and feel guilty. I don't want to be blamed for the fact that we didn't try out this idea many years ago. Well, the barnyard pig was next. Well, he said, Miss Hen, you go right ahead and try out your nice little idea. Of course, I'm busy with all of my enormous responsibilities here, so I don't have the time to help, but I know you'll do a good job. And then finally was the billy goat, who was the boss of the barnyard. Well, I want to support your work. I'll arrange for you to be able to apply for a grant so that you can purchase some of the farming equipment that you're going to need. Well, because no one was able to help, the little red hen went ahead and learned how to grow the wheat and mill the grain and bake the bread. And along the way, she made some mistakes, but she learned from them. And in the end, the bread was good. And it was a great addition to the barnyard, just as the little red hen predicted. And so it came to pass that every year, the little red hen went about her tasks. She tilled the soil and planted the seeds. She weeded the field and watered the soil. She harvested the wheat and milled the grain. She baked the bread, and everyone enjoyed eating the bread. And then one day it happened. The little red hen decided to retire. And because the dog and the cow and the pig and the goat and all the other citizens of the barnyard had not learned the skills of farming and milling and baking, because none of them had had the courage to change, because none of them had had the time to try new ideas, because none of them had had the willingness to share in the responsibility, well, the barnyard never again had freshly baked bread. That's the end. So in summary, I just wanted to say that the goal of diversity through equity is far too important for us to give up just because it's hard, or just because it's new, or just because it makes us uncomfortable, or because we don't have time. All of us and all of your colleagues back home, I hope that we will all commit to culture change through reflection, learning, and accountability. And I think now is the time to begin. So I appreciate your attention this morning. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Asai. And thank you for leaving us a few minutes extra for reflection. One thing we want to reflect on is the evaluation that we just put in the chat room, and encourage everyone to take a few minutes here, and this will help you process what you've just heard. And again, want to encourage you throughout our meeting, as Dr. Asai has encouraged us, to reflect, to learn, and then out of that, to hold one another and ourselves accountable. Also want to bring to your attention another link I've just put in the chat box that there'll be more focus on later, but as we have a few minutes here, feel free to start looking at this. For our second workshop, we'll be using this idea board, and there's some questions posted there. And so if you'd like to do some reflection during this next few minutes that we have available, you can start going there and begin some content in there. Unless any of our other leadership have some comments, we're going to go ahead and take a break here till about 11:15. So have about half an hour here. And again, encourage you to take this time to reflect, catch up a little bit on your email so that when we come back, you can be fully focused on the next speaker. Marcia, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Since we do have a little bit of time, I think that some people may have questions for David Asai, and so I'd like to ask David if you'd be willing to take some questions.
Sure, be happy to. Thank you.
I have a question, please. What are your thoughts on a middle ground for standardized tests? In their current form, I agree they really need to be jettisoned from many systems. But as a debate gets simplified very quickly to be yay or nay, could it be that they could be used as a baseline to identify if there are potential issues with basic problem solving? And even then, that should not be a primary filter for an admissions decision. But I think that sometimes admissions processing gets superficial and just leans on them too hard. And maybe the best answer is to jettison them. But I just wonder if there's some middle ground where they may yet be informative. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that you jettison them. What I'm saying is that if you're going to use them, figure out why you want to use them. And so people do use standardized tests for to diagnose, as sort of a diagnostic tool, especially after the students are already in. So you could uncouple your your assessment of skills that need work from the admissions stage, right? For example, you could use the achievement test, the advanced test on the GRE in a particular field to figure out what areas the student might require some courses or should take some courses in, but that need not necessarily be part of the admissions process. The studies that came out of Carolina, there also have been studies at Vanderbilt and UCSF and up in the Northeast consortium of schools. They all found that the GRE was not predictive of success as measured by completion, as measured by papers published, as measured by any number of things. The Chapel Hill study was interesting because, in fact, it showed that very few things that we typically rely on necessarily are correlated with success in graduate school. And that really the one thing that sort of stood out that does help, that does really help, is are the letters of recommendation. And so what Carolina then did was to really beef up the structure and the expectations that go into the letters. So it's not just, hey, this is a great student, top 1%. By the way, when we all say, this is a top 1% in my class, they can't all be top 1%, right? Unless you've had 1 million students, you just, not everybody's going to be top. And so when these rather general terms that we often use in our letters of recommendation, what Carolina has done is has been really to put a little bit more specificity there. And as I understand it, the data show that after they stopped using the GRE and after they went to more of a holistic admissions process, the students that they admitted are doing just as well as students who had been admitted before. It wasn't like the quality just suddenly dropped. What they also saw was a significant uptick in the number of students from peer groups, from underrepresented groups who made it through to the interview stage and then were admitted and then decided to come. It was about a twofold change. And so that to me is a signal that they're on the right track. And as I said, you can look at some of the work from some of the other places as well.
Thank you. We have a question here. If you could repeat what the PEER, peer label, stands for.
Right. And so I published that in a couple of places. So if you can look at the Cell paper in 2020, I give the acronym there as well. So PEER stands for persons excluded from science because of their ethnicity or race. And this is simply meant to be a replacement for the term URM. And so when I talk about this, I often get questions from folks saying, yes, but there are other forms of identity which are really important. There's abilities, there's physical ability or disability. There's gender. There's, yes, absolutely. But URM did not, when you use URM, we're not talking about other characteristics also. We generally are talking about race. And so I'm just using peer as a replacement for URM, fully respecting all the other dimensions of identity that are also very important.
So someone wrote in the chat, I'd love to see that Carolina letter prompt. We're considering such a change in our department. Do you have a way to share that?
I don't have it. I don't work at North Carolina, but you could ask. So Joshua Hall is the director of graduate admissions for their, I don't know the name of this acronym, but it's all in the life sciences. So they have this large program in the life sciences at the medical school and at the main campus. So Joshua Hall is there, and I have no idea if it's legal for him to share with you the prompt, but you could certainly ask him, or you could get one of your students to apply to North Carolina.
Okay. Are there any, somebody asked if you could speak more to the second question raised, how to decide who's worthy to stay?
Yeah, I think too often we rely on certain metrics, and so let me use promotion and tenure as just one example, and perhaps that's not that's certainly not the only domain to think about this, but let's just use promotion and tenure as an example. As we all know, our universities will promote and tenure based on research, teaching, and service. We probably aren't really good at measuring the effectiveness or the impact of any of those things, but at least for research, we typically count papers, we typically count grants, dollars. For teaching, we often rely on teaching, student surveys and things, which again is not really a good measure of effectiveness of teaching, but at least we have some quantitative ways. But why shouldn't we also include in our criteria the effectiveness and the inclusivity of the person who is up for promotion, whether it be in their teaching or in their mentoring of people in their labs, for example? And there are ways of asking how effective a mentor is. And so if we can then create ways of measuring that and then incorporating those measures into promotion and tenure, I think that would be a really important step forward. So more than just counting dollars and papers and so forth, or even students, what we should be asking as well is how effective all of this is, what has been the impact, and especially in terms of the realm of mentoring and inclusive teaching. I think those are areas that we can do a much better job. So that's what I meant. I was also referring to our reliance especially in the STEM disciplines, that we look at a person's pedigree, we look at a person, well, the person went to this school, a person has so-and-so in their academic pedigree. And we often overlook, or we look differently at persons who don't have the same pedigree. And so a lot of these things come into play, but I leave it up to people. I leave it up to you all to think about these things. I think Mark has a question.
Hi, David. Always good to see you. And as the program officer for this North Carolina Alliance, it's great to see everybody together for this wonderful event. David, I've read your work and I think highly of what you're doing, and we enjoyed having you at NSF recently. I noticed that in response to the queries, a lot of people put funding as the issue, and Maureen shaking your head going, yeah. And David, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I'm guessing what people are saying is they need more money to do what they want to do.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they'd love to see that come from HHMI, NIH, and NSF. But I'm curious if you want to make any comments about that.
Well, thanks, Mark. You know, as Maureen said in your introduction, you know, you mentioned that I had been in the academy for, it added up to about 24 years. And of course, all that time I was getting my grants, right? I would be getting my grants, got to get my grants. Now, maybe it's just me, maybe it's not anybody else, but for me anyway, it was often the case where if I got a grant, I felt that I had accomplished something. But in fact, really, a grant is a start, right? It's just giving you some funds to actually now do something. And so the grant wasn't the end, it was the beginning. And so when I came to HHMI now 13 years ago, it's taken me a long time to get to the other side, if you will, to think differently about grants. So HHMI, as you know, gives grants. In fact, a couple of the institutions represented here today are part of our various initiatives, Inclusive Excellence or IE3. And so you have resources from us. And what I'm noticing is that while money is certainly important because it certainly pays for activities, what we often don't do when we are figuring out how to spend the money is to actually ask, so how can we actually change the culture of our institution? And now I don't mean to trivialize this at all, but I'm just going to say that the work that goes into changing the culture of the institution, the reflection, the learning, and the holding oneself accountable, that doesn't cost any money. It does not cost any money. It does take time. And so that's why I've been talking about time recently. I talked about time when I was at the NSF a few weeks ago, because time is that precious resource, which I think is just not enough. We just don't have enough of it to take all of our good ideas and all of our champions to actually be able to do this work and to actually spread the word back in our university so that it's more than just a few folks doing it, but it's a lot of folks doing it. And so one could argue, well, you know, time is also money because it costs us, you know, we have to do, yeah, okay, fine. If that's what money is for, then that's a good use of the money. But if we don't just take the time to reflect, to learn, and to hold ourselves accountable, then it won't change. An example, if you want to change the promotion and tenure practices or rules on your university, it does not require money. It requires a hell of a lot more than money. It requires a lot of people having a lot of hard conversations and debates and, oh my gosh, both in your department and then above your departments. But if you have the will, then you can actually make that happen. And we've seen a few universities now begin to change the way they do promotion. Or if you really want to hold mentoring as something that's important, that doesn't, you don't buy good mentoring, right? You get good mentoring by learning how to do it and then giving people the time to practice it. So it's easy for me to say that because I'm no longer in the position where I'm applying to Mark and others to get more of the NSF money or HHMI's money. But this is also a perspective that I feel strongly after having lived this for a long time. I think it's worth a conversation or a debate. And I hope that you will think about these things.
Follow up, David, appreciate, of course, your perspective. And just as a reminder to everybody in the Zoomland world that we're in today, AGEP has changed our program to focus on institutional change. You know, we're not doing what you've been funded for to do now, but keep in mind, you can now apply for a $4 to $4.4 million project to do institutional change. It is unfortunate that so much money is needed to get leadership to take this on. But we feel that at NSF that if we don't do that, your institutions aren't going to make the time that David's talking about. They aren't going to give it the priority. So extra funding beyond what you've started will be available in the near future. Thank you, David, as always. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark.
So there are 2 or 3 more questions in the chat, and we have about 4 minutes left. So I'll give you the first one of these. From your perspective, what are some of the best practices to promote peer individuals to move into the professoriate? With so many options available, many of my former students are choosing alternative career options, scientific writing and communication, DEI positions, directors of undergrad and graduate research programs, etc.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely have to celebrate the success of our students, no matter what they choose to do. And if they are learning how to do good science, if they're earning a PhD, then they are now experts in science. And if they are learning some of the skills like communications and writing and working with people and building relationships, all of those things will be really important for them. And so I think that what we need to do is to understand that while individual success of our students, no matter what they choose to do, we want to celebrate that. If we have a program that is also thinking about, we want to move more of our talented students into the professoriate, then we need to also think about how we do that. And I think one of the important things, again, is that we, all of us, need to communicate to our students the joy of being in the academy. There are a lot of benefits of being in the academy, of being able to pursue science in an academic situation. And so it's not like you're evil if you don't go into one or the other kind of a thing, but rather just giving people the understanding of what it's all about. So I don't have a deeper answer than that, but I believe that actually makes a big difference. What's the other question, Marcia?
Well, actually, I looked at all of the chat, and it's all about different people talking about funding. So that was the last question. I think that's a great question to end on. So I want to thank you again for the wonderful talk and the challenge to us to all take the time to discuss all these issues, learn more, think about them, and start moving more toward action. So
thank you.
This is really an important talk.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to Karen's talk in a few minutes. So it's been really good to be with you. And now I'm going to be part of the audience in just a little bit. So thank you. Thank you all.
We now have a 15-minute break, and Keith just put in the chat the link for the evaluation for the morning session. So please attend to that, and we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.